Celeste is a game about mental health and mental illness, depression and anxiety, hope and fear, courage and self-doubt, strength and weakness, failure and perseverance. It is a game about pushing yourself to impossible heights, completing unbelievable feats, and taking incomprehensible leaps of faith. But more than anything else, Celeste is a game about learning to love yourself. There is sort of this stigma around games with themes about mental health and mental illness. This idea that indie games that discuss these ideas are all mass-produced, thematically unoriginal, cookie-cutter, trend-chasing garbage. This idea that just because there are so many games that tackle the topic of mental health, it is impossible for any of them to be creative or original. But what the people who make this argument are seemingly failing to consider is that maybe there are so many games about mental health because there is simply a lot to be said, a lot worth saying, and a lot worth listening to. And I think that what Celeste in particular is trying to say is, to me at the very least, incredibly interesting. So let's try this one more time. Celeste is a game about climbing a mountain. The central metaphor of Celeste is relatively simple. The mountain that main character Madeline spends the entire game climbing is more than just a mountain. It directly represents all of the mental health struggles that she and the game's other characters deal with every day. Their depression, anxiety, vanity, anger, and self-loathing all physically manifest all around them as they struggle to beat insurmountable odds and attempt to climb the seemingly unclimbable mountain. Madeline's story begins at the base of the mountain. She struggles to complete even the easiest part of her climb, nearly dying along the way in a moment that is meant to show her inexperience with dealing with her own mental health issues and how unprepared she is for the journey ahead. It shouldn't be a surprise that Madeline is already struggling to climb the mountain. Many people find themselves unable to climb their own mountains, both literal and metaphorical, on their first attempt. But Madeline stubbornly refuses to give up. She is unprepared for the difficulty, but not unready for the journey. This is also when Madeline meets Granny. Granny symbolizes many things over the course of Madeline's journey, but in this moment, she personifies Madeline's own self-doubt. She tells Madeline that she isn't ready to climb the mountain, laughs at her for even trying, and encourages her to give up. In actuality, Granny is merely joking and offering Madeline a warning for the struggle inherent to the journey ahead, but Madeline's own frustration and self-doubt cause her to view Granny's words as hostile, so she lashes out at her, a trait not uncommon to those suffering from depression, and stubbornly continues on her journey. She may have handled it incredibly poorly, but this interaction shows that Madeline is committed to climbing the mountain, committed to growing, and committed to her own success. Despite all her many flaws, she is ready. The level immediately following is the first real level of the game, and already Madeline's journey is shockingly difficult, incredibly demanding, and painfully unforgiving, and it only gets harder from here on out. Of course, that's what makes the game fun, both as a casual player and a speedrunner, not that I'm particularly good at either, but the game's difficulty also embodies the difficulty inherent to directly addressing one's own mental health issues. Overcoming things like depression and anxiety is never as easy as simply taking breaths or choosing to be happy. It is an endless, all-encompassing struggle that affects every aspect of your life, even if you don't actively realize it. Just trying to beat mental illness in any capacity means dealing with failure after failure after failure. But what is important is that you don't let your failures and setbacks define you, that you never give up, that you never stop trying, and you never let your journey end in failure. Just like Madeline, you need to keep getting up and pushing forward. And even in its first level, Celeste drills that message into the player's skull through its gameplay. The second level sees Madeline in a moment of literal self-reflection. Standing in front of a mirror, we see not Madeline's true reflection, but rather a twisted depiction of how she sees herself. A cruel, evil manifestation of all of her worst and most debilitating traits. The creatively named Madeline is repeatedly referred to as a part of her, and represents everything Madeline believes to be wrong with herself. Everything she is trying to escape by climbing the mountain has manifested as a secondary, inescapable being that follows her everywhere she goes and actively attempts to stop her from climbing the mountain, both through words and acts of violence. Madeline serves as a secondary antagonist, with the mountain itself serving as the first. The two entities represent different sides of Madeline's journey, the things she is trying to escape and the things that she needs to overcome. But Madeline finds more than just an enemy in the depths of the game's second level. She also finds a friend. Theo is a listless, directionless Instagram influencer hopeful who spent his entire climb taking selfies and is climbing the mountain on nothing more than a whim. He initially comes off as incredibly vain and self-centered, even forcing Madeline to take a selfie with him despite her obvious discomfort at the mere idea of a photo of herself existing. No doubt a direct result of her own self-loathing. But we quickly learn that Theo is a deeply kind and understanding person whose friendly attitude is not the narcissistic facade it initially appears to be. Madeline initially treats Theo coldly in the hopes of keeping him at a distance, but the two quickly begin to bond as they swap stories of their journeys, and the first connection of Madeline's new support system is formed. The next level directly juxtaposes Theo's kindness and support with the introduction of a minor antagonist in desperate need of his own source of support. In this level, Madeline meets Mr. Oshiro, an incredibly anxious, lonely, and extremely dead innkeeper desperately trying to save his business despite the fact that it already failed years ago. Mr. Oshiro's own anxiety, self-doubt, and inability to let go of the past has rendered him unable to move on, both from the inn itself and from the land of the living, essentially leaving his soul trapped in the very inn he loved in life and turning it into his coffin. Madeline desperately attempts to help Mr. Oshiro get back on his feet by helping him clean the inn, despite knowing full well that Mr. Oshiro is actively trying to get her to stay rather than continue her journey. His actions are a direct threat to her physical journey, and his inability to address his own mental health issues is a threat to her metaphorical journey as well. Regardless, she tries to help him anyway, partially because Madeline is a people pleaser, as people with mental health issues often are, but it's mostly because she pities him. She views Mr. Oshiro as a sad, pathetic man trapped in his own head. But what she fails to realize is that they are actually incredibly similar. Madeline and Mr. Oshiro are both anxious, depressed, people-pleasing loners with insane anger issues, dangerous self-destructive tendencies, and a complete inability to view themselves with any meaningful sense of self-awareness. Mr. Oshiro is a warning for what Madeline will become if she continues refusing to directly address her mental health as it continues to deteriorate, and it is only through Madeline's cruel and furious intervention that Madeline is able to escape Mr. Oshiro's trap and get herself back on track. The message here is obvious. Those suffering from mental hardships absolutely need love and support to recover, but sometimes helping them can mean hurting yourself instead, and you can't help anyone if you haven't first learned to help yourself. In the game's fourth level, Madeline has another run-in with Granny, who offers her an easy trip to the bottom of the mountain, another chance to go home, another chance to just give up. Madeline angrily and stubbornly denies the opportunity and pushes forward. She is fully committed to her journey, a conviction that is only further enforced as she fights against the strong winds of the game's fourth level. Winds that, much like every other obstacle in this game, no doubt represent the inherent struggles that come with any journey of self-improvement. But her refusal to succumb to the pushback of the winds represents her commitment to the journey and her refusal to give up. Two things that are necessary when attempting to address mental health issues in any capacity. And at the end of the level, Madeline is reunited with Theo, and the two take a shortcut in the form of a gondola ride. The two swap stories of their climb up the mountain and offer one another encouragement and support as the gondola stalls and begins to shake. Madeline appears suddenly as Madeline succumbs to her anxiety, having a full-blown panic attack. But she doesn't intervene, or make things worse, or even try to convince a weakened Madeline to give up. In a seemingly uncharacteristic moment, Madeline merely watches in silence, unseen and unheard. Madeline yells at Theo, her anxiety causing her to lash out at the nearest person. She blames him for their current predicament despite the shortcut being entirely her idea. Her words are cruel and unfair, but Theo is undisturbed. He understands and he cares. He's dealt with this too. So he teaches her a trick to steady her breathing and calm her down. It works, if only temporarily, and Madeline disappears. Theo's trick is helpful, but temporary. It is not a solution to anxiety or depression in any sense, and it won't work every time. In the end, what really helped Madeline was Theo's support and patience, because it is those we care about and those who care about us that allow us to survive our darkest moments. The next level is the Mirror Temple, which brings back the theme of reflection. However, the mirrors of the temple don't reflect the actual physical appearances of Madeline and Theo, but rather exaggerated personifications of their struggles. The vain wannabe influencer Theo is put on display, first behind a mirror that resembles a window, then in a crystal shaped like a display case, surrounded by ever-watching eyes. Madeline, however, is drowning in darkness, and she is chased by monsters that she believes to be horrifying manifestations of her own anger and cruelty. The two friends face their demons together and manage to escape the temple by the skin of their teeth. As they rest by a campfire, Theo tells Madeline his story. We learn that he isn't really vain at all. His obsession with photography is a way for him to feel closer to his deceased photographer grandfather, and contrary to his confident personality, he actually has a massive inferiority complex due to his older sister's overwhelming success. Success that he believes he will never be able to achieve because he doesn't even know what he wants to do with his life. He isn't directionless out of self-obsession or childishness, but out of fear of making the wrong decision. A feeling not unfamiliar to Madeline or to much of the game's core audience. Meanwhile, Madeline confides in Theo, describing the hardships she faced in her attempt to scale the mountain. Theo simply listens. And having found someone who cares enough to just sit there and listen, the two characters learn to hate themselves a little less and love themselves a little more. But the chapter doesn't end there. Madeline, emboldened by the day's victories and her conversation with Theo, confronts Madeline with the goal of releasing her. Believing Madeline to be nothing more than the worst parts of herself, Madeline decides to leave her behind. The implication being that in a moment of happiness, the emotionally immature Madeline believes that her journey of growth and self-discovery will allow her to permanently overcome her anger, depression, guilt, anxiety, selfishness, and self-loathing. But that's not how it works. It's not that simple. You don't just get to choose when to get better and move on. The journey doesn't end just because you're near the summit, and mental illness and emotional trauma isn't something that just goes away. So Madeline rejects Madeline's perspective and knocks her back to the base of the mountain for the game's penultimate level. Reflection sees Madeline at her lowest point, trapped at the bottom of the mountain, cut off from her only friend, and forced to reevaluate the viewpoint she had only just committed to. This level is a perfect metaphor for the unbearable lows of a depressive episode. People with depression will often plummet towards rock bottom, cut themselves off from their support systems, and make every possible wrong decision because the stupid fucking worms in their brains tell them that it is what they deserve. But what is important is that they don't listen, that they don't succumb, and that they don't give up, even as every fiber of their being screams at them to just stop. They need to keep pushing, keep fighting, keep going. And so from the bottom of the caves to the summit of the mountain, Madeline tries again. But first, she must speak to Madeline. With some advice from Granny and some newfound self-awareness, Madeline seeks out the other part of her. She finds Madeline sad and alone and angry at the very thought of being left behind. Madeline lashes out at her, just as Madeline did to Theo and Granny, but Madeline is different now. She is starting to understand. She chases Madeline and forces her to listen. She acknowledges her as a part of herself, but more than that, she accepts that Madeline is more than just her worst aspects. This part of her serves a purpose. Madeline claims that she cares about Madeline, that she was only trying to protect her, and suddenly everything falls into place. Madeline didn't try to stop Madeline from climbing the mountain out of cruelty. She was worried for her safety. She only lashed out at Oshiro to help Madeline escape the inn, and she appeared on the gondola to support Madeline in her time of need. All this time, Madeline cared. All this time, she only wanted to help. She is more than just Madeline's worst traits, greatest struggles, and most debilitating debilitating thoughts. She is also her trauma responses, her subconscious acts of self-defense, and her coping mechanisms, both good and bad alike. And when used correctly and healthily, she can even be a force for good. And Madeline accepts this. She accepts her. She accepts herself. And the two halves of one whole face the mountain together, side by side with their support system behind them, preparing to attempt the climb one more time. Preparing to reach for the summit. The game's final level sees Madeline and Madeline traveling through all of the game's previous levels before eventually reaching and climbing the area surrounding the summit. Each of the areas meant to represent previous levels is significantly shorter than the levels they are based on, which serves both a practical and thematic purpose. The practical purpose is that it doesn't really make sense from a game design perspective to force the player to replay 6 entire levels just to reach the end of the game, while the thematic purpose is an attempt to show Madeline's growth. Thanks to all of the experience, wisdom, emotional maturity, and self-acceptance that she gained over the course of her journey, climbing the mountain has not only become easier, it has finally become possible. It is still incredibly difficult, oppressively long, and reaching the summit will not cure her mental illness. But Madeline's emotional journey has given her the tools necessary to escape her rock bottoms and climb her emotional mountains as many times as she needs to. As they journey back up the mountain, Madeline and Madeline talk to one another. They discuss the journey both ahead and behind them, the people they met along the way, their emotional state, and their relationship with one another. And as the two characters get closer and closer to the summit, they understand one another and themselves even more. They accept themselves, flaws and all, and they finally begin to heal. And when they finally reach the summit, they lament the fact that they will have to return to being a single person when they leave the mountain. They regret the idea of no longer being able to travel side by side, no longer being able to live together, work together, or talk to one another. As they travel to the summit, the two characters learn to care about one another, support one another, and even love each other. And as a result, they learn to love themselves. Madeline learned to love herself. And that is the answer that Celeste is trying to provide. It isn't easy or perfect or all-encompassing or even permanent, but learning to love yourself despite all the pain, learning to care about yourself despite the self-loathing and self-hate, learning to accept yourself despite the stupid fucking bitch in your head telling you not to, that is the mountain you need to summit if you want all of the other mountains to become easier to climb. But loving yourself isn't as easy as it sounds. The people filled with the most self-hatred, the ones most in the need of self-love, are often the ones most incapable of feeling any. It is a seemingly infinite mountain that only becomes all the more unclimbable when one is facing the sort of struggles that Madeline, Theo, and Oshiro deal with every day. When you've hated yourself for so long, it feels impossible to love yourself, impossible to even want to. After everything you've been through, after everything you've put yourself through, how could you possibly learn to love yourself? How could you possibly want to? Well, Celeste answers that question too. The answer is simple and obvious. You just don't do it alone. Because it can't be done alone. You have to find people who love and support you and learn to love and support them too. You need to talk and to listen, to help and be helped. Undeniable progress can be made when working alone, but there will always come a time when being alone becomes unbearable. So you have to surround yourself with other people. People who care. People who support you. People who want you to succeed. People who love you more than you could possibly believe. And it is when they give you their love, as overwhelming and embarrassing as it is, and as undeserving as you feel, that you will finally realize that maybe, just maybe, you aren't all that unlovable. Celeste is a game about mental health and mental illness, depression and anxiety, hope and fear, courage and self-doubt, strength and weakness, failure and perseverance. It is a game about pushing yourself to impossible heights, completing unbelievable feats, and taking incomprehensible leaps of faith. Celeste is a game about many things, but more than anything else, it is a game about looking at the inconsistent, imperfect, incredibly flawed, seemingly unlovable piece of shit in the mirror, and slowly, painfully learning to love them despite all the reasons not to.